The folks that are used to the house have just been asking. This is your panel.
All right. Oh, did it just gavel for me? Oh, I like the Senate. That's fun. Okay, very fancy. All right, the Joint Subcommittee to study the consolidation and scheduling of general elections will come to order. Senator Van Valkenburg isn't here today, so you are stuck with me. The agenda of this meeting is going to be reviewing the effects on statewide administration and local administration of elections. If we were to move forward with consolidating and scheduling consolidation of general elections, we'll have two speakers today, Susan Beals, the Commissioner of Elections, Eric Olson, Director of Elections and General Registrar from Prince William County. We've heard from them both before, so excited to have their comment. We will have time for public comment at the end, and at this moment, the clerk shall take the roll.
Senator Servo, Senator Deeds. Here. Delegate Price.
Here.
Delegate LaVere Bowling. Here. Delegate Helmer.
Here.
Delegate Bloxham. Here. Delegate Ballard. Commissioner Susan Beals.
Here.
Honorable Lisa L. Lucas Burke.
Here.
Honorable Jessica Schneider. David Levy. Here. Tracy Howard. Senator Van Valkenburg. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. With that, pending, is there any wish for any comments from the panel? All right, seeing none, let's go ahead and move to our witness. Commissioner Beals, please. From one seat to the other.
Impacts of consolidating elections on election administration specifically. Today I'm going to talk about the offices that are impacted, how this would impact special elections, the impact on election administration, and the impact of voters. When we think about which offices would move to a federal election year, this chart gives you a very holistic look of elections over the next 5 years. You can see the statewide, General Assembly, county, city, town, and school board offices would move. So the elections of 27 and 29 there would need to be absorbed into the federal election years. One issue that I wanted to highlight is the scheduling of special elections. This is how some other states handle special elections. Many states that have solely even year elections still have their special elections in their odd years. Many of them also still have their municipal elections in their odd years. I know we have changed that in Virginia to a May to November, but just be aware that saying we're shifting everything to an even year doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to have any elections in those odd years. For example, in 2025, Michigan's going to hold their county elections and special elections this year. North and South Carolina hold their municipal elections this November 4th, along with their special elections. Tennessee holds its city elections on dates all throughout the year this year. And Maryland is holding their special elections and municipal elections this year. I wanted to provide you this spreadsheet because this is all of the local special elections that are happening this year in Virginia. There's over 70 of them. So this is not General Assembly, this is just local city, town, county offices. As you can see, these are for offices where an office holder resigned or vacated their seat that would have been filled in 26 or 27. And on the far right, you can see the date that office ends. This slide does not include those special elections that we've already held in 2025, including 2 Senate seats, 1 House of Delegates seat, and a congressional seat that's in early voting right now. So as you know, special elections for vacated seats in the General Assembly are required to be called within 30 days of the vacancy when the General Assembly is not in session. When the General Assembly is in session between the dates of, and the vacancy occurs between the dates of December 10th to March 1st, the election must happen within 30 days of the vacancy. So that is going to make us have special elections in odd years. When considering the impacts to election administration, I tried to look at both sides of the coin for you, so you're going to see 2 slides on each of these. I wanted to give you an idea. This is some of the tasks that we think as a department we would have more time for if we had even election years. We would be able to spend time on more in-depth accessibility surveys of polling locations. We would have more time to update our training materials. We would have focused time for procuring and building new IT projects instead of trying to build them while we're also running elections. And we would be able to work more deeply with our designated state agencies who promote voter registration. We would also have a longer runway to implement legislation. For the department, many times, by the time a bill becomes law in April-ish, we have about 60 days to get it implemented before we have to start training registrars on it so they can then carry it out when early voting starts in mid-September. It is a very tight turnaround. So if we had no elections in odd years, that might give us more time to implement legislation. On the flip side, here are some other impacts to election administration. You're going to have fewer voter interactions at the polls, and that is a lot of times when voters update their information. They go to their old polling place, they go, oh my goodness, I've moved. Under our policies, we will allow you to vote there if it's been less than a year, but if that was going to 2 years, that becomes a different conversation. We might require, that would also potentially require more same-day registrations. It might also result in more people being designated inactive because maybe they don't respond to a mailing. They're also not going to vote, and they might end up on the inactive list. This might require either additional risk-limiting audits or longer timelines for risk-limiting audits. Under current law, RLAs are required after every election prior to certification. Not every state does that. Some states have their RLA after certification. We've got to get that in there before we certify the results, so it typically is in that Thanksgiving timeframe. In odd years, we do RLAs of House and Senate General Assembly races. Those would have to be moved to even years, and then you might need to consider, are we doing RLAs of, a congressional, a U.S. Senate, a House of Delegates, a Senate race. The electoral boards even have the authority to do a local race that's entirely in their jurisdiction. And if that all happens, do you want to maybe elongate that time frame for them to conduct that RLA? So those are some administrative considerations. Requiring a change to the campaign finance review requirements. As you know, we had a new law that was implemented this year. We had the first report that came out July 1st of a campaign finance review of campaign committees. The first year that we looked at was 2024, and since it only applied to state races, we only looked at local races, and we did a review of 7 local committees. In 2026, that report is going to be much more robust because it's going to look at 2025 races, and by law, it must include every statewide committee, whether or not you won, lost, were a primary person who lost, 10% of all House of Delegates races, and 1% of all local committees. That is going to be tens of thousands of committee entries that we have to consider in those campaign finance reports. So you would want to consider, do you want to then move that to 2027? Do you want to maybe put a longer time frame on that? Right now, that report is due July 1st. Do you want to move it to October 1st? Those are all potential considerations. And then finally, voting machines. Combining elections into even years may require more voting machines, and let me tell you why. With a longer ballot that's going to take more time to feed into the machine, and potentially a multi-card ballot, you're going to end up with lines at your voting machines. It's going to take the machines a longer amount of time to read them, to accept them from the voters. You're going to have more mistakes from voters. You're also going to have more undervotes. Every time you have an undervote, which means you failed to vote for every office on the ballot, it spits the ballot back out, right? It is set to do that. So you're going to have a holdup at your voting machine, and it may require more voting machines on Election Day. Additionally, on the back end, printing results tapes and completing those statement of results paperwork that happens in the precinct on election night is going to take a lot longer, as is entering election results into the election night reporting system, which means results are going to come in later on the evening on election night. For those localities that are required to print their ballots in multiple languages, we have 4 right now. The way that they accomplish this right now is they just have a long ballot. So in Fairfax County, for example, they have a 19-inch or a 22-inch long ballot. It has every language in there with the office. You have it in all 4 languages. After speaking with them, they let me know they would have to move to a different ballot for each language. And then that becomes a little bit complicated because how do you decide, especially with your absentee voters, what language do you send them? Do you have to institute a process where they make a specific ask to have their ballot in a specific language, or do you send them all 4, maybe 8 pages of ballots in different languages for your election? This could also introduce some other election administration questions. If the voter were only to complete 1 page of the ballot, like we talked about, how would that affect ballot reconciliation at the end of the night in the precinct? How would it also impact recounts or post-election audits? In the last meeting of this committee, there was discussion around combining the June primary in a presidential year into the March presidential primary. So I put together a timeline for you for the filing of that and what that would look like based on the days and deadlines that are set in code. This shows the candidate filing dates and deadlines for this kind of primary in March. And if local offices and General Assembly offices were combined into this primary, as you can see, candidate filing would largely be over Thanksgiving and Christmas. That time there between the 23rd to the 28th is when it would occur. Additionally, early voting would start during the legislative session when campaigning and fundraising is currently prohibited. So you might need to consider a change there as well. And I know sometimes our sessions run a little bit longer, so your election day is March 7th. That's going to be your General Assembly primary date. You could potentially still be in session at that time as well. So on the 2 sides of a coin on impacts to voters, on the one side, you definitely will see higher turnout if you combine your elections into even years, and you're going to have more people voting and participating in state and local elections because you're just going to have a higher turnout. But by only voting in federal election years, you're also going to have cost savings to voters. If they only have to go to the polls once every 2 years, that's a savings on travel, childcare, time away from work, all of those things. It would be a less cost to our voters. Your election dates would be simplified. It would be clearer to people when election day is, when they're supposed to be there, when you are on that federal schedule. And educating voters about election days would be simplified as well. But some of the other impacts to voters might include a longer ballot, potentially a 2-page ballot, ballot fatigue, voters failing to vote for those at the bottom of the ballot, a more complex voting experience. And when I say that, what I mean is right now, when you have somebody who is walking into a polling place, a lot of times they're getting a sample ballot that's sort of giving them an indication of what they might want to vote for. They're going to have to remember how to vote for a lot more offices, right? Right now, it's maybe 5 to 10 offices. It's going to be a lot longer if it's everything moved into a federal year. You may have more wait times, longer times at the voting machine, longer waits at the voting booth. You may have more opportunities for mistakes on ballots. And then finally, a reduced focus on state and local issues in favor of national candidates and national issues. And that completes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide you any additional information.
Senator Deeds, go ahead.
Since the majority of states, 48 or 49 of the states already have federal, all their elections are in federal years, you agree that a lot of the problems you enumerated are problems that already exist in the majority of states, and the problems that we're just talking about things that we have to adjust to. Like the longer ballot, that's what.
Chair, Senator Deeds, as I said, there are a good number of states that run their municipal and county elections in odd years. So not necessarily everybody is on an even year schedule. And I think it's important to note that a lot of those other states, they had that set up from the get-go. Like we have built an entire system in Virginia on having an election every year.
Right.
Whereas these states have been having elections in even years for many, many years.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. So I know in Chesterfield, our electoral board has been talking about possibly doing voting centers to ease some of these. Is that something that might help to get it be more flexible for people to be able to vote at any of like what are now our satellite locations that are for the last week of voting, and let anybody vote anywhere and have the ballots be printed at that site?
Chair Helmer, Supervisor Schneider, voting centers would require significant change to the code. There are a lot of rules right now around the placement of precincts, how close they need to be to your house when you're locating a precinct. There are some federal laws there too about ease of voters finding a place to vote, whether or not they're taking public transportation or how they're choosing to get there. And so there's a lot of considerations that you would need to make for what changes would need to happen in the law. But there are certainly other states that have voting centers, and they make that work.
Are there further questions? Okay, go ahead. Delegate Bloxham. I'm glad it's not just me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just clarification on voting centers, because in my area, I mean, I'm assuming that means that you'd have remote locations where someone could come in and vote for anyone. I mean, they'd get the ballot for their municipality, since I have 17 towns, so that therefore I have 17 elections. So if we had 4 voting centers, you'd have to have 17 ballots. I'm just trying to get clarification for a voting center, whatever that is.
Mr. Chair, Delegate Bloxham, if you had a voting center, you would probably need a ballot on demand printer. So that would allow you to print the ballot that is needed for whoever decides to show up. A lot of that is used already in early voting in our satellites. They use ballot on demand printers, but you would need a lot more ballot on demand printers.
Delegate Price.
Thank you. Madam Commissioner, can you go into promise. Thank you. Can you go into more when you were saying that there could be potential impact on recounts? I think you were talking about that when you had just finished talking about the different ballots for different languages. Was the potential impact on recounts connected to that, or was that a separate thought in what the potential impacts could be?
Mr. Chair, Delegate Price, that is related to having a two-page ballot. Particularly if you have some voters who choose to only fill out one page, it makes it, and those are maybe hand counted, it just makes it a little bit more complex when you're doing a recount.
I see Levy. Mr. Levy. It's a real challenge.
There we go. Yes, Commissioner, our election officers on election day serve 14 to 15 hours, not including the deputies or assistant deputies. How many of our polling places have part-time election officers, or how do they deal with these extended shifts, especially if we're looking at a longer shift?
Chair Helmer, Mr. Lee, I am aware of some localities that do shifts, but I would say the vast majority of localities have the same people there because it is required that when you arrive in the morning, you're signing that zero tape and you're attesting to that, and then you need to sign the results at the end of the day. So I would say the majority of precincts in Virginia have officers of election that serve the entire day.
Thank you. Commissioner Beals, just one question from the chair, which is, you mentioned the two-page ballot or the multi-page ballot. For localities that today do have even year elections, I believe Virginia Beach has some, I know there are some others that do have elections. Do any of them end up in a multi-page ballot situation today and are able to deal with that?
I'm not, Delegate Chair Helmer, I'm not aware of anyone that has a two-page ballot. I know last year, I believe, or 1 year recently, Fairfax County got close, and they managed to keep it all on one. The reason that it can sometimes shift to a two-page ballot is if you have multiple referenda, and then if you have ranked choice voting on top of that, that can make it have a very long ballot.
Thank you. Delegate Price, go ahead.
Thank you. And I wanted to also ask, when speaking about that with the ranked choice voting had me, you just mentioned it, wanted to ask the question, because not only with the 2 pages, and I think I'm trying to think through various sections of code, right? And all of the things that are playing into this, and we might need help from our wonderful attorney. But right now, we have the ability for localities to choose to do ranked choice voting, but only for certain races. And so could you speak a little bit more about what a ballot could potentially look like if there was not the situation of like the municipals in the odd years, but if everybody was on that ballot, and let's say a presidential that could also have like statewide candidates, that could also have House delegates, that could also have, let's say, city council, and in a locality that was allowed to do ranked choice voting for the local, how many different types of elections would be on that one ballot, and then what would it look like for you all's purposes?
Chair Helmer, Delegate Price, the issue for going to a multi-page ballot, from my understanding, is that is not an issue for voting machine vendors. They can do a multi-page ballot. I think that for ease, most of our registrars have tried to keep things on one page. And so they have sort of already tested the limits of how long that can go. I think the longest that a machine can read is somewhere between 19 and 22 inches long for a ballot. And so I think a lot of them have tried very hard with font size changes and everything else to get that all on one ballot, because it just makes everything simpler. But I think, when we heard last time about the bond referenda from some of the locals, if you're putting that plus a constitutional amendment, plus all of these offices, plus ranked choice voting, you probably would end up with a 2-page ballot. There's no way that you couldn't.
Go ahead.
And so thank you for that, because I think your question specifically talked to the logistics of trying to handle that on the pages. And can we also talk about that question from the aspect of a voter? What would, I guess, your office seek to do? I'm trying to think through just, I've been voting my whole life, ever since I could. And if I go into the ballot and I have a presidential race that has, the federal laws and all of that involved statewide, and then we get down to a local race that has ranked choice, what type of outreach would you all do? Because right now, I'm guessing most ranked choice ends up on a different ballot than the elections that don't have ranked choice.
It's on the same ballot.
Same ballot. Okay. We don't have it in my locality, so I'm just trying to work through it. So would that not then be new to the localities that already do ranked choice? They already have mixed ballots, ranked choice and non-ranked choice.
They don't have separate ballots. It's all on one ballot.
But mixed one. Okay. I've never seen that. So that's great. So that's not necessarily something that a locality that currently does ranked choice voting at the local level, that process wouldn't be different. But let's say if there was a locality that had never had ranked choice, we consolidate, then there would need to be some outreach then for, there's no ranked choice on this one, but there is ranked choice on this one, and it's all on the same ballot.
Chair Helmer, Delegate Price, I think that outreach, frankly, that would need to happen would be encouraging voters to vote all the way to the bottom of their ballot. Because I think that a lot of voters, when they go in to vote, they will maybe vote by party. And then as you get lower down the ballot, people don't run with a party. And then you've got referenda questions, and it's not, the answer is not very clear to some people about which side is this leaning, or how do I decide? And so I think that's where you're going to see the slowdown for the voter. It's very easy to do maybe the top couple offices, and then as they get further on down the ballot, they would slow down and take longer to vote because they're looking at nonpartisan races. and then referenda that they have to make decisions on. I think the voter education piece is going to be around, what's on the ballot, making sure you vote to the end, understanding the referenda, understanding that we have nonpartisan candidates that are also on this ballot. Right now, I'm not aware of anybody that does a ranked choice ballot versus a non-ranked choice ballot. Every county that I know that does that, which right now is just Arlington, and I think Charlottesville is either almost there or about there, it's included in the regular ballot.
All right, Ms. Lucasberg?
Thank you, Commissioner Bills, for the presentation. I guess all of the conversation is prompting a question. Extending what going to the even years would impact the decision to change or increase or decrease early voting days, and how would this impact smaller locations like where Portsmouth is small, and I know there's some other localities that are smaller than us, but has there been any consideration that this might impact the need to revise our early voting options?
Chair Helmer, Madam Lucasberg, I haven't looked at that specifically. I think that, perhaps you could encourage voters to vote early so they would have more time, to consider their ballots. But then I think you might also run into the issue of a voter coming in maybe to vote early, looking at a ballot and saying, wow, that's really complicated. I want to go home and do some more research, and then maybe come back on election day and vote once I know who I want to vote for. And that might result in a high number of spoiled ballots.
All right, Mr. Levy.
Yes, Commissioner, what limits are there on the March presidential primary? In other words, is that a political decision to have that date in March as part of a Super Tuesday, or is there a range of dates we could opt for on the March presidential primary that would set that date?
So Chair Helmer, Mr. Lee, in terms of moving the June primary to the March date, that is a legislative decision.
Right.
In terms of the actual date, that is a party decision that they, I think, negotiate and make.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Do any of our members attending online have questions? Obviously, I wouldn't be able to see them from here. I don't see anybody raising their hand. So with that, thank you so much, Commissioner Beals, for your testimony. And next up, we will have Mr. Eric Olson, who's the Director of Elections, the General Registrar for Prince William County. He's also a repeat offender. We are very much looking forward to hearing about the impacts on the local administration of elections. The floor is yours, Mr. Olson.
All right. Good morning, Chair Helmer and members of the Joint Subcommittee. Glad to be back with you today to talk a little bit more about election administration. So the last time I was here, we talked about budget impact, which is a little more specific. Today, it's going to be broader, and I'm happy to answer questions. There are about 400 pages of code, so might have to get back to you on a few questions, but certainly some of the ones you asked earlier we can address as well. So
400 pages of presentation, right? Not 400 pages of presentation.
Only about 30. So, all right. So I am representing here today the Voter Registrar Association of Virginia, which is the membership association for the 133 localities, counties, and cities around Virginia. Our mission is to promote integrity, transparency, accessibility, and impartiality in running Virginia's elections. I'm the Director of Elections for Prince William County, and I've worked with localities across the country, actually. I've worked for Maryland, Virginia, and D.C., but I've also worked with North Carolina, Fort Wayne, Indiana, British Columbia on a whole bunch of different projects of how you implement different things for elections. I'm also a licensed attorney, so it helps me look at the code a little bit, and I'm representing the VRAV in this forum today. So I'm going to note right off the bat that any election schedule that we're talking about is going to have some positive and negative characteristics, and consolidation of elections would mostly change how we work, not whether elections themselves would work. So we're going to review all the functional areas of election administration today, going to cover the ways in which consolidation could change that work potentially, and the possible opportunities and costs. I'm going to go through a number of areas. What I'm going to do in each area is talk about whether the consolidation is a low, medium, or high impact to that particular area, and then talk about the positives and negatives, the weight of which is obviously the legislature's work to determine what that comes out. I'm going to examine some specific code areas. Some of these are ones that require change, and some of these are where change would be advisable based on the experience of the registrars around the state. So the examination of this topic intersects with a wide range of election administrative duties, regulations, and laws. And some of them should be considered to make any change as effective as possible. Some of them also, while we're talking about them, may warrant review regardless of the consolidation of elections. They sort of are either current problems or things that may need to be addressed in the longer term. So I'll talk first about general administration. I think this is a pretty high impact area. So in the positives for consolidation, it would provide time for compliance, strategic planning, and implementation. Commissioner Beals talked about this, and there's a number of areas where we would have more time to focus, either with a more reasonable schedule or in more depth than we do at present. That provides the opportunity for some incremental improvements, which is another positive potential here. It would also give some of us time to recuperate. The elections, we run 4 to 5 elections in a 2-year cycle, sometimes more. So election officials in Virginia have more stress than election officials in other states. Added to that are these off years where we have national money that pours in, and there's additional stressors that come from that where we're looked at as a bellwether state when we're not in our even years. Some concerns about this are local funding decline. We talked about that extensively at the last session, and then the potential institutional knowledge loss. So how could that change maybe the individuals that are involved in this, both at an election official level and also at an election officer level? So those are some of the concerns. In terms of administration, election administration, right now we run elections, and we do all these non-election year things kind of in the cracks in between those elections, which can be very challenging. So we're talking about things like equipment and facility upgrades, the state security standards and ADA compliance, COOP plans and emergency planning, working with our police and fire to anticipate how we respond in emergencies and how we handle situations where there's safety concerns for voters. Implementing new laws. I put an asterisk by this one because this obviously affects your work as well. Your work might be more emphasized in certain years leading into the election year than it is in other years. We update our training and our forms. We are redistricting and polling place changes would be more likely to take place in the odd years. We would have more time for professional development and meeting certifications, including state level training. List maintenance processes would be different, potentially. There would be probably more voter education and transparency initiatives in those off years. And then we would have time for the state and the locals would have time to work together for improvement on the guidance and implementing of laws and problem areas. So it would really change kind of the workflow that we have. So a few compliance schedule code considerations. GR performance is currently an annual thing. It would make more sense probably to do that just in the odd years before the elections and then evaluating how the elections went. Voting equipment security would be a similar thing. It is an annual thing right now. That could be moved to odd years. And risk limiting audits are done on at least a 5-year time frame. That would likely want to be shifted to a 4-year time frame if you have elections that are consolidated in only the even years. In terms of office hours, the office shall be open a minimum of 5 days a week. If you're not having elections every year, I'm not sure if this is necessary. To be honest with you, the number of visitors we get in person at the office is not a large number with online registration and same-day registration both being available. So I'm not sure that this doesn't fall in the category of things that should maybe be considered. There's a lot of alternative work schedules that are available now where a lot of county offices in our county work only 4 days a week. So certainly given the stresses on election officials in general, this might be something that could be considered for a move anyway. But certainly if there was consolidated elections where you didn't have an active election year, there might be some sense in changing this. The commissioner talked about times for special elections. I think that's an important consideration. How would you all modify the code and examine the code to make sure that that makes sense to fit with schedules? Right now, it is a real challenge for some of these special elections where you're fitting them in between a primary and a general and having another special election. it is a real challenge for local election administrators. So there could be potential solutions there that make sure that the continuity of government continues, but that the voter intent for the candidates that were departing and potentially incoming is preserved. Redistricting would also be another area. So considering how the census fits into potential consolidation, considering how reapportionment impacts the terms and the completion of local offices in coordination with a potentially changed schedule is another area. And then minimum staffing requirements. We talked about this a little bit the last time, but VRAB is supportive of proposed legislation in this area that would ensure all election offices have at least 2 full-time employees that are working in elections. We have more than 20 localities at present that have less than 2 full-time employees, either just 1 employee period or 1 person and maybe a part-time person. This does ensure some leadership redundancy in last-minute changes. It also makes sure that the continuity of operations continues in all of our cities and counties, especially in our smaller counties where the staff is very small. So moving on to voter registration. I think this is a low-level impact area, but there's sort of a yin and yang here. There is on the plus side, with fewer elections, it does provide the opportunity for potential list maintenance activities that could improve our voter rolls and some things that maybe we're not doing at present or that we could do better with more time. At the same time, on the downside, more elections do provide more opportunities for voter updates. So we're interacting with voters. Same-day registration activities are happening every election. So there is a sort of constant flow of registration activities when you have a constant flow of elections. Pre-registration might also want to be looked at, 24.2-403. This allows persons who are not yet 18 to register. I believe based on the language of that, it says that those individuals can vote in an intervening primary, and that language might want to be tweaked just slightly so that it wouldn't allow someone to vote in a primary when they're still much younger than when the next general election would actually be now. So that would be a small language change, but one that would likely be necessary. All right, on mail voting, again, I think this is a fairly low-level impact, although there are areas where it could be significant. We'd want to have more focus on outreach and education in this area, but there's possible postage and envelope issues. Commissioner Beals talked about the potential for longer ballots and multi-page ballots, which can be a challenge. I have some experience of that. I work for Montgomery County in Maryland, which is about the same size as Fairfax, and we had a 3-page ballot one election, and it was a real challenge, especially during early voting. Now, we did not have ballot-on-demand machines, which made it even more difficult, so there are some mitigating factors there. But certainly when you're talking about the postage costs, you're talking about the staff that is having to, the election officers, when they're pulling the ballots out of these envelopes, it taking longer to complete that process and having missing pages and things like that, that is an impact. So no real big things there other than the potential for longer ballots and multi-page ballots would make that process a little slower, a little more complicated, especially in larger jurisdictions like mine and other large jurisdictions around the state. Regarding early voting, so this is sort of a medium and high impact. I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more. We have an extensive early voting period in Virginia for 45 days. So that mitigates some of the potential issues here because we do have one of the longest early voting periods of any state around the country. But when you have more candidates, referendum, and longer ballots, then you're going to have the potential for significant wait times at polling places and challenges to the existing facilities without both code changes and resources that are involved in that. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is a polling place or an early voting site. It doesn't matter. When you're having, let's say, this is planning for about 1,400 voters that are going to come through on a given day, which is not uncommon for us at our early voting sites and certainly some of our busier polling places. And here you might have 3 check-in stations and you might have 10 voting booths. It just depends. You'd like to have more than that, but sometimes space doesn't allow for that. It really depends on a lot of different factors. So in a situation like this, the chart that I'm showing here is sort of hour by hour throughout the day. And you can see that, so the x-axis is each hour by hour of the day. The y-axis is how long does it take to vote? How much wait time is there involved in that? In this chart, when you have a 2-minute ballot, in other words, the voter goes into the booth and they take 2 minutes or less to vote, your only wait is at the check-in station, which is in yellow here. So at peak times when you maybe have bigger crowds, either after work or first thing in the morning, you might have a short wait here. So you might have 15, 20-minute wait, a little bit less, a little bit more with this kind of flow. And so let me show you what this looks like then if you have a 4-minute ballot. So that's not that much longer, but these little increments really make a difference. When you have people peeling off that check-in station, now they're coming to a voting booth and now they're backing up a little bit. And every couple minutes, as you add another person, that line gets longer and longer. And certainly we saw some of this in 2012 and 2016, where there were long lines. And this chart is exactly what happened then. Either not enough check-in stations where that yellow area would be larger, or the pink area, which is the time people are in voting booths. You can also potentially have scanner lines if you don't have enough scanners. So the commissioner talked about that, about the need for potentially more scanners in certain locations that are busy, especially at early voting sites. So it's just a note that is, sort of a visual look at what that can look like. So in our code right now at early voting sites, each county and city has to provide voting in person in the office of the general registrar or a voter satellite office. That office requirement is a little restrictive because the office is not necessarily either the best location in the county always, or it's small. I know in my county, that's both. We are in a little island of property right in the middle of Manassas City, so we are 2 miles for many of our voters, and our office is pretty small. We don't have a lot of space. They have to kind of check in a hallway. They go down and vote in a conference room. They scan their ballot in a foyer. So it's not the best location for us. Now, we do have a number of satellite locations in Prince William County, and there's a lot of large localities that are going to have multiple locations, often for several weeks, sometimes for the whole period. But that office requirement can be a little restrictive. I think you also see a very uneven application across localities. You all had asked about vote centers during the questions, and I think one way to think about voting is to think about it in terms of, tell you the term site days. So when you're talking about, if we have 100 polling places that are open for 1 day, that's 100 site days. If you have 3 early voting sites that are open for the full early voting period, that's about 35-ish days of voting for the accounting for the days that it's closed. That's about a little over 100 site days as well. So right now, if you look at especially in the larger localities, your number of site days is really variable. Other states do account for this sometimes. In Maryland, they actually have a number of voting site requirements. So based on the size of the county, the population, you have to have a certain minimum number of early voting sites as the county gets larger and larger. So taking off the restriction of the office would be one way to accomplish this. Looking at what are the minimums that voters should have so that you don't have counties. Fairfax has really extensive early voting opportunities, obviously as a large county, but even proportionate to the number of voters, they have a lot more than some of their mid-sized counties have. So what are ways that you can make sure that voters across Virginia have kind of even access to the same number of early voting opportunities that they do in other counties? So looking at those potential modifications and mitigating some of those challenges. Obviously, early voting is more and more popular. We're seeing at increasing levels that roughly half the voters in Virginia, nearly half of the voters in Virginia are voting their ballot before Election Day, whether that is at an early voting site or in mail voting. So as you provide other opportunities there, as you expand not only the number of days, I'm not recommending more than 45 days, by the way. That's a long enough period. But if you have more sites potentially in some of our larger counties in particular, that could mitigate some of these challenges. So as I noted, the office may be too small in some locations. Satellites in larger localities may need to be re-examined. So if this was put in place, I imagine I would be working with our local board of supervisors, and that probably happen in a lot of counties, to consider how to expand, change, modify early voting to match some of the potential conditions that we're talking about. And this is going to be a particular challenge for our high-density regions, for our really large counties in particular. As I noted, potential solutions: removing the office requirement, potentially putting in some minimum number of voting sites, providing resources obviously would be a great aid to this, and looking at timeline modifications. And you all noted vote centers as a possibility for that. I think when you're talking about vote centers, you're really just talking about that site days model that I was talking about. You're not talking about 3 sites or 4 sites open for 30 days, so 100 to 120 site days, and then 100 on election day, you're maybe talking about 20 sites that are open for, X number of days. But that site days number is really the ultimate determiner there. You want more of those so that people have more opportunity. And unfortunately, the sad reality with early voting is always that your most popular day is going to be your last day. Your next most popular day is going to be the next to last day. So you do have to factor in that people will wait till the very last opportunity to vote, and you have to think about that in terms of the voting, the sites that you're giving people an opportunity to vote at. Election day itself, kind of a medium impact here. I think you're less likely to have logistical issues on election day just because of the popularity of mail-in early voting. In recent years in Virginia, election day used to be sort of a big event, and it was a lot to prepare for, and it's still a lot to prepare for on an administrative level, but we don't see some of the logistical problems that maybe we did 5 or 10 years ago because we have a lot more people using mail voting, using early voting, and spreading out that pressure. So that is less pressure on election officials on that day. On the downside here, and I will say, in terms of election officials themselves, this has kind of been both in our membership. There are people that think that, on the one hand, not having as many elections will give those officers a break because not only do they work on election day, but we have we have 100 officers or more in Prince William County that go and work canvass, that work mail voting, that support the early voting sites. So they're doing a lot more than just those single election days. On the other hand, some localities have reported that they may lose election officers without having constant elections, that is actually a little bit of a detriment then. So I think there's kind of a plus and minus there that kind of cancel each other out. Election officers may not be in practice, though. That is one positive to Virginia's current schedule. Our officers are kind of constantly training, constantly being prepared for elections. So we'll have to make some modifications and considerations for our training as we go through. So a couple considerations here. There are some requirements related to the amount of voting equipment that are at polling places. There are some requirements as to when voters exceed 4,000 in a presidential election, that we have to split up that precinct. Would you want to apply that to the non-presidential years because you might have larger turnout in those and you might be able to spot trends and potential problems sooner? And then looking at 24-2, 627, what is the threshold for the number of voting booths you need? How many scanners do you need now if that ballot is potentially longer? So those are some areas that you would want to look at. In terms of election officers, 24-2, 115 talks about the appointment of election officers. I could do a whole hour just on this code section because it is pretty complicated and there are a lot of challenges to it. So there are recruitment challenges with this. There are party parity limitations, and this is really impossible to accomplish in some localities. If you have a county that is predominantly Republican, it's really hard to get Democrats. If you have a county that's predominantly Democratic, it's really hard to get Republicans. So this has been a constant source of an issue and would be in a consolidated election as it is now. Nonpartisan officers are actually a large and growing group, and I've talked to other registrars that are saying that they're getting more people that are coming in as nonpartisan officers. So there could be some potential for changes to this. That might be changing. One suggestion has been to change the major party, minor party to the chief and assistant chief role, and then let all the other positions fill in. You would still have representation from both parties there, but you wouldn't have this sort of never-ending search for Republicans or Democrats in counties where they are really hard to find. So that would be a challenge. That's a challenge now, and that would continue to be a challenge in a consolidated election system. So a couple alternative structures here, moving states' elections to even years, but possibly retaining odd years for localities. This would be more of a 3-in-1 system. So rather than having it be all in every 2 years, you could potentially consolidate the locality years in some ways. I know this doesn't work for all the terms as they exist now for some of your boards of supervisors are on staggered schedules. Some of the terms do not line up with that 4 years, but that is one potential consideration. The other possibility here, we talked a lot about funding the last time, and the current state funding local model is that the state covers basically the GR salary and the electoral board salary, at least most of it, and the locality covers all the other costs with the exception being the presidential primary. One way to possibly look at this as we're looking at consolidated elections is, would it make more sense for the locality to cover the baseline administrative costs? So the locality is covering the salaries, the building, the election equipment for all the elections, and then the state would reimburse for the election costs on this now consolidated schedule. One potential benefit of that is that prevents some of the budget concerns that we're talking about at the local level, where you have these swings every other year in how much funding that you need, and also concerns about some localities that might really reduce their funding, where, you know, we almost can guarantee that some a local government administrator is going to say, oh, well, half the election's half the cost, and we know that that is not true. So this would also mitigate unfunded mandates as well. If the state approves changes to have more early voting or some other options, well, that would be built right into a different funding structure where the state is actually covering that while the locality continues to cover those baseline costs. So that could enable a little more uniformity of voter services across the state and allow for, if the state is trying to promote or push special programs through legislation or fund certain areas, that would make sure that is preserved, rather than that game where it sometimes happens where the state provides extra funding and the locals cut it, you know, commensurate with that. And that happens at the federal and the state level as well. So overall, there are challenges and benefits to election administration. There are important factors to consider, but how this impacts voters is obviously going to be, you know, a really critical one for you all to consider regarding turnout and their experience. That's obviously the most critical factor in the work that we do, is making sure our voters have a great voting experience when they go to the polls, and we work to support that in all of the work that we do. I think overall we're looking at, there are certainly here opportunities to improve compliance. There are opportunities for outreach and voter education. There is potential for reduced pressure on election officials, Virginia election officials. We kind of have it the worst, maybe, of any state. So there's the potential to take a little pressure off us, especially in the last 5 years or so. That has increased. On the downside, there's something to be said for steady practice. Steady as she goes, and every election being able to get that practice in and have that constant training is a positive for Virginia in a lot of ways. And the combination of higher turnout with longer ballots could create some potential challenges that we've talked about, some ways that they would need to be mitigated in order to prevent things like really long lines on election day or at early voting sites in a consolidated system. So consolidated elections can be implemented effectively if the necessary code and regulatory changes are considered, if resources are not undercut, and with proper timing and planning. So I thank you to the subcommittee for including VRAV in this process and for enabling us to come talk to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Olson, for your insightful presentation. I see that we have a question from Delegate Price.
I want to say thank you, first of all, because I was just about to see what my biggest question was, what are the code implications? And you broke down some of the code sections that we need to pay attention to. But I did have a couple of questions, Mr. Chair. And one, I want to understand more about your slide on the office requirement restriction, because when I was looking at the code, it says the office or the satellite. And so can you explain a little bit more if like, say, for instance, you gave an example of the office may not be the best place, but the code does allow for or satellite. So can you explain more of that and your pros and cons sort of look at it?
Sure. So Chair Helmer and Delegate Price, thank you for the question. The code requires us to have early voting at the office. So localities can add satellite locations, but that can't substitute for the office also having early voting available at it. So we're required to have it at the office, but then you can add satellite locations beyond that. So I think in most localities, I don't have an exact number, but I think it's probably somewhere around 3/4 of the localities only have early voting at their main office location. And then there's going to be a small number that have satellite locations.
I'll just take the chair's prerogative. Mr. Attorney, do you think you could take a look at that code section and see if is it an or is it a?
Mr. Chair? Yeah, so 701.1, I don't know what Alex read on this is, and maybe they read it as requiring. There was a change made in 2020 that put in the OR satellite, which I would read as allowing you to have a satellite in lieu of doing it in the GR's office. But again, I don't know what the interpretation is of everyone else. So, I mean, you could interpret it as saying you have to do both, but I think it does provide the option to do one or the other.
In the absence of anyone jumping to answer that question, since that's not quite the main purpose of your presentation, we can definitely revisit that maybe in a privileges and elections meeting. But then I also wanted to ask, because you pointed to 24.2-627 and the voting equipment. And I just want to make sure, because I think last meeting we were talking about how it's done differently across the state. So can you run back over how a registrar determines how many voting machines to have either at the office for early voting, at the satellite, or at a specific precinct?
Chair Helber and Delegate Price. So the determination for that is that each locality has to kind of go through that, some of the model that I talked about, and look at how that impacts them. Now, I think if you're a small locality, it's not necessarily a huge formula. When you're talking about larger localities where you might have, we have early voting sites where we have 2,000 or 3,000 people coming in, in a single day to a single facility. So we have to look at, how does parking work? How many check-in stations do we need to have? How many voting booths do we have? How many scanners do we have? And there's a certain amount of time that it takes at each of those locations, and you have to kind of calculate out, okay, if we have 4 people coming off check-in every 45 seconds or so, how many voting booths do we need if they're taking X amount of minutes to vote a ballot? Then when they're coming off those voting booths, how many scanners do we need? What time are people taking at the scanner? I think Commissioner Beals noted that if you have a longer ballot, you have potentially more issues, that you need to factor that in and think about that. So there are formulas for that. The state code does provide certain minimums. I would say that we're usually thinking about things beyond those. Those are good minimums to have, but we're usually thinking about beyond those at some of our busiest locations. And we kind of try to think about things in terms of what our busiest hours are going to be at these sites and how we get through those with as few logistical problems as we can.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we were going to ask for the Registrars Association to come up with a roundabout estimate figure for how many more machines would be needed based off turnout from, the last presidential election, is that possible, or is that something that it's too many variables because you don't know how long the ballot's going to be, or et cetera?
I mean, it's based on a lot of variables. We could certainly come up with a minimum, like a recommendation for what that might be and how that might change from the current code to a consolidated election code. It is going to vary. And as I noted, I think most registrars are going to be looking at, okay, do I need additional beyond that to make sure that they have enough scanners and equipment that voters are able to get through in a reasonable amount of time.
And Mr. Chair, I would just ask that we move from a hypothetical to an actual request of however the association might best come up with an estimate, because I think when we're thinking about budgetary impacts and whether it's unfunded mandates or coming from the state, that I don't think anybody wants to do something that is going to make it harder for people to vote. I can speak for me. That is not my intention. So if it was going to be a longer wait, okay, how many more machines could help? I think that would be helpful. And then, Mr. Chair, I just had one last question. So I was speaking with my colleague last meeting when someone said something about the increase in postage, potentially for a longer ballot, but thinking through, I think it's about maybe 4 or 5 pages you can put in an envelope and mail it under the same postage for that. Can you speak a little bit more about the process for the longer ballot? And two-parter, can you explain a little bit more about if someone either consciously or unconsciously decided to not vote down ballot, how that causes an issue for the administration of the election, because there are some people that it's a conscious decision, but it sounds like whether it was a mistake or a conscious decision, it interrupts your process.
Yeah, okay. Chair Helmer and Delegate Price. So to answer those two questions, okay, so first the postage part, I think we'd have to look at that and test out, if we have a current, like a 14-inch ballot, let's say, on a single piece of paper, because there's a couple other items that go in with any postage that goes out. There's going to be a letter that gives people instructions. There might be some special inserts and things like that, depending on the election. So we need to look at that. I think, hey, what is a 14-inch ballot that's 1 page cost in terms of postage? And if you have a 19-inch ballot that's 2 pages or 3 pages, what does that cost? So we certainly could provide the joint subcommittee with some data on testing that out in a bunch of scenarios and seeing what that tipping point is. Where does it hit that next ounce that the post office says, all right, you got to add some extra cents to this postage. The second question was about the functioning of the equipment. So when you set up your equipment for each election, there are certain variables and options you have as an election administrator. So you can set it up so that if a ballot is completely blank, it does automatically reject. If a ballot has a blank side, so for example, if you have a ballot where you only have 1 or 2 contests on the back and you want to make sure that people don't miss those, you can set it so it rejects that back. You can also set it so it rejects it back for any contest that is not filled in, where they didn't select any, but there's an undervote for a contest. In our county, we generally set it for blank ballots or blank sides, but we don't do it for individual contests because people often consciously skip over them. And at the volume that we're working at, that would create a lot of logistical issues. So we do account for that. Presently, you would obviously have more of those issues, though, if you had a longer ballot with more contests on it that people could potentially miss some. So.
Thank you. Delegate Bloxham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question, I love the slide where you showed the timing and how long it takes. Do you also have a similar slide, or can you get a similar slide about the number of people during each day of the early voting? In my experience anyway, it looks like the first week is really busy, then it kind of trails off, and then the closer you get to election, as you said, it gets busier and busier and busier. So just if you were going to adjust it, not to get rid of early voting, because I actually like early voting, but 45 days to me seems a little extreme. So just if I could see that, some type of data from the counties, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Chairman Delegate Bloxham, we can certainly supply some data. I think you're correct in that what we often see is the first few days of early voting is really busy. The people that want to get out there and vote and get their ballot cast, then it lulls for a while, and then it builds and builds and builds back again. And then what we usually see is those last 2 or 3 weeks in particular get really busy, and the last day or two is always, very crowded. So we'd be happy to provide some data on that. I should note too that the line optimization tool is on MIT, has an election toolkit. So the thing I generated today, you all can feel free to go and check that out. It's very interesting. It kind of shows you what different scenarios look like on there as well. And I think that VPAP also has some really excellent data on early voting, but we'll be happy to supply some data to the joint subcommittee on kind of day by day what that looks like.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Olson. Thank you so much, members of the joint subcommittee. I see no further questions. This is our final meeting prior to this year's session of the General Assembly. And with that, before that, are there anybody here for public comment? Seeing none, the committee shall rise.